Into the narrow alleys of the medieval city, where the stench of raw sewage and rotting straw clung to every stone, a different atmosphere began to take hold behind the fortress walls. Through the iron-bound oak doors of the royal palace, a thick and heavy steam started to seep into the corridors, carrying with it the intoxicating scents of crushed rose petals, rare musk, and spiced hot wine. This humid veil acted as a sensory barrier between the harsh reality of the outside world and the manufactured paradise within the sovereign's private chambers. It was a signal that the day's burdens were being shed in favor of a much more intimate and secretive engagement. While a desperate thief gasped his last breath upon a wooden gallows in the central market square and hungry rats scurried through the stagnant gutters of the slums, the king moved toward a ritual of supreme indulgence. Behind thick stone walls draped in heavy tapestries, the ruler prepared for an act that the court physicians officially labeled as a necessary hygienic procedure for the preservation of health. However, in the whispered rumors of the servants and the silent observations of the guards, it was known as the most carefully guarded vice of the 14th century. This was not a simple act of washing away the dust of the road, but a calculated immersion into forbidden sensory pleasures. The great hall of the baths was a sanctuary of dim light and suffocating warmth, where every surface was meticulously covered with thick oriental carpets to prevent the precious heat from escaping through the masonry. At the center of this artificial tropical climate stood an enormous wooden tub, its rough timber completely concealed by layers of the finest bleached linen to protect royal skin from splinters. Beneath the surface of the swirling, fragrant water, the outlines of several figures were already visible, their movements fluid and ghostly in the rising mist. These were the women of the shadows, individuals whose names would never be recorded in the official ledgers or dynastic chronicles. This gathering was far removed from the solitary and somber acts of repentance encouraged by the Church, transforming the concept of washing into a complex ritual of absolute power and dominance. The water served as a translucent shield, a fluid curtain that supposedly purified the soul while simultaneously providing a convenient cover for the satisfaction of the most carnal of appetites. Under the watchful but expressionless eyes of the silent palace guards, the monarch stepped into the warmth, surrendering his heavy velvet robes for the embrace of the steam. In this space, the traditional hierarchy of the court was momentarily suspended, replaced by a more primal order where a touch was more valuable than a decree. The air grew heavier as more boiling water was poured from silver basins, releasing fresh clouds of vapor that obscured the faces of those present, making them appear as celestial or perhaps demonic entities. The soft splashing of water against the linen lining of the tub was the only sound that dared to break the reverent silence of the chamber, creating a rhythmic pulse for the unfolding scene. Each movement within the water was deliberate, a choreographed dance of service where the distinction between a servant and a lover became entirely indistinguishable to any outside observer. It was a theater of the flesh, played out in the humid darkness of a room that held more secrets than the king's own confessional. As the heat intensified, the scent of the oils became almost overwhelming, a mixture of lavender from the southern hills and exotic spices brought by merchants from across the Great Sea at an immense cost to the treasury. The king's attendants moved with a practiced grace, their skin glistening with perspiration as they tended to the fire beneath the copper boilers in the adjacent room. This was a logistical feat of significant proportions, requiring dozens of servants to maintain the temperature and the supply of aromatic infusions throughout the long afternoon. To the common folk outside, such an expenditure would have seemed like a miracle or a madness, yet here it was merely the baseline of royal existence. Within the depths of the great tub, the interaction between the monarch and his companions took on a quality of dreamlike fluidity, where the boundaries of the body seemed to dissolve in the shared warmth. The soft murmur of water and the occasional clink of a glass against the wooden rim indicated that this was as much a feast as it was a bath, with floating trays of fruit and wine bobbing between the bathers. Every gesture was designed to reinforce the king's status as a living god who could command even the elements of fire and water to serve his comfort. The nymphs who surrounded him were chosen for their beauty and their silence, their presence a living testament to the ruler's absolute ownership of the realm. Despite the opulence, there was an underlying tension in the room, a sharp awareness that this sanctuary was temporary and that the world beyond the doors was filled with plague and political intrigue. The contrast between the soft, wet skin inside the tub and the harsh, leather-bound world of the knights and tax collectors outside was a divide that could only be bridged by this ritual of immersion. It was a moment of profound vulnerability disguised as a display of immense wealth, where a king could be just a man, provided he remained surrounded by the steam and the women. The very concept of cleanliness was being rewritten here, not as the removal of dirt, but as the saturation of the senses. As the hour grew late and the candles began to flicker in the damp air, the significance of the event became clear to those allowed to witness its conclusion from the shadows of the doorway. This was the true seat of government during the summer months, a place where whispered suggestions into the king's ear carried more weight than formal petitions presented in the throne room. The bath was a political engine fueled by desire and draped in the guise of medical necessity, a place where the sweat of the ruler mingled with the perfumes of his favorites. In this humid twilight, the future of the kingdom was being shaped not by the sword or the pen, but by the friction of skin in the dark of the hall. Finally, as the fire in the boilers began to fade and the steam thinned, revealing the exhausted faces of the participants, the illusion of the timeless paradise started to fracture and pull apart. The king would soon emerge from the water, his skin pruned and pale, to be wrapped in dry furs and carried to his bed, leaving the tub to be drained of its scandalous secrets by the dawn. The used water, now oily with the remnants of the afternoon's excess, would be poured into the same gutters where the rats continued their tireless work. The cycle was complete, a brief escape from the grim reality of the Middle Ages had been achieved, leaving only the lingering scent of roses in the empty hall. By the middle of the 14th century, the European continent underwent a profound transformation that elevated the simple act of bathing from a humble medical suggestion into an elaborate social obsession of the ruling classes. What had once been a practice advised by ancient texts to balance the four humors of the body evolved into a sprawling cult of the elite, where water became the primary theater for the display of status and wealth. From the mist-covered streets of London to the sun-drenched plazas of Florence, the establishment of the public bathhouse, known as the stew, signaled a massive shift in how the medieval mind perceived the human body and its relationship to the surrounding community. These public institutions began to proliferate within the city walls, easily identifiable by the massive clouds of white steam that billowed from their chimneys and the distinctive wooden signs hanging above their heavy oak doors. Inside, the roar of enormous hearths heating copper cauldrons provided a constant background noise to the rhythmic chatter of patrons from all walks of life who sought refuge from the cold. Though the common folk frequented these spaces for a few pennies to scrub away the grime of labor, the aristocracy demanded a level of luxury that turned a communal basin into a temporary palace of cedar and silk. These venues were far removed from the dirt of the medieval street, offering a controlled environment where the senses could be indulged without limit. The Church maintained a complex and often contradictory stance toward these centers of immersion, publicly decrying the perceived dangers of public nudity and the many temptations of the flesh. In sermons delivered from cold stone pulpits across the land, friars warned their congregations that the heat of the bath mirrored the fires of purgatory and that such pleasures would lead to spiritual decay. Yet, the financial ledgers of the great cathedrals and monasteries told a vastly different story that was hidden from the eyes of the common believer. Many of the most profitable and popular bathhouses in Paris and Southwark were actually built on land owned by the high clergy, with bishops and abbots collecting substantial rents from the very vices they condemned. In the local vernacular of the period, the word soap began to lose its literal meaning and became a thinly veiled euphemism for the illicit activities that took place behind the heavy bathhouse curtains. When a nobleman announced his intention to his peers to seek out the finest soap in the district, those around him understood that he was not looking for a cleansing agent but for a specific type of sensory entertainment. This linguistic shift reflected a broader societal acceptance of the bathhouse as a place where the strict moral codes of the era were temporarily suspended in favor of personal indulgence. It was a world within a world, where the rules of the daylight hours were replaced by the fluid morality of the steam and the shadows. Within the fortified manners of the landed gentry, the bath moved from the public sphere into the private heart of the domestic space, becoming the primary setting for both hospitality and high-level diplomacy. A visiting knight or a neighboring count would be greeted not with a meal or a rest, but with an immediate invitation to join the host in a massive, aromatic tub that could comfortably hold half a dozen people. This was considered the ultimate gesture of trust and friendship in the 14th century, as men who spent their lives encased in heavy iron armor found their only moments of true peace while floating in the warm, scented waters. To bathe together was to prove that one carried no hidden daggers and possessed no ill intent toward their companion. These communal sessions were never silent or somber affairs, as the resonance of the wooden tubs and the echoes of the tiled chambers encouraged a unique form of intimate and often dangerous conversation. Deals that would reshape the borders of entire counties and determine the succession of titles were brokered over floating trays of roasted peacock, candied nuts, and spiced pears. Musicians were often hired to play lutes in the far corner of the room, their melodies serving to mask the sound of secret negotiations from the ears of eavesdropping servants. The presence of water seemed to dissolve the rigid protocols of the royal court, allowing rivals to speak with a frankness that would have been impossible in a cold council chamber. Central to this experience were the bathmaids, young women whose roles were as fluid as the water they tended, serving simultaneously as nurses, waitresses, and objects of silent desire for the guests. They moved through the thick and heavy steam with a practiced efficiency, their light linen tunics clinging to their frames as they poured hot infusions of chamomile and mint over the weary shoulders of the bathers. Their hands, softened by constant contact with warm water and expensive oils, were the instruments of a comfort that most medieval citizens could only dream of experiencing. These women occupied a unique social space, bridging the gap between menial service and the most intimate spheres of noble life. The sensory experience of the 14th century bath was one of extreme intensity, specifically designed to overwhelm the participant with a richness that countered the gray monotony of daily existence. The walls of these chambers were often painted with vivid murals of hunting scenes, mythical gardens, or celestial bodies, which seemed to come alive as the flickering torchlight danced through the swirling vapors. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedarwood and the sharp, clean tang of vinegar used for hair rinsing, creating an environment where the passage of linear time seemed to slow down and eventually disappear. It was a total immersion in an artificial reality that privileged the body over the spirit. The very name of these establishments, the stews, carried a dual meaning that was not lost on the inhabitants of the time, referring both to the steaming pots of broth and the heated bodies within the tubs. Just as a master cook would simmer a variety of ingredients together to create a rich and complex flavor, the bathhouse brought together different elements of society into a single, simmering mixture. This metaphorical stew was a potent symbol of a culture that was beginning to value physical comfort and aesthetic pleasure over the harsh asceticism of the past. The heat of the water was seen as a transformative force, capable of softening even the most hardened warrior or the most calculating politician. While men dominated the public political discourse of the baths, women of high status also developed their own sophisticated bathing culture, though it was often shrouded in even more mystery and exclusion. Noble women would gather in private suites for the entire day, using the warmth of the water to discuss the intricacies of royal lineage and the hidden scandals of the queen's inner circle. For these women, the bathhouse was one of the few places where they could exercise a degree of autonomy and influence away from the prying eyes and restrictive control of their husbands. In the safety of the steam, they could forge their own alliances and decide the fates of their children's marriages with total privacy. No session in the tubs was considered complete without an elaborate display of culinary excess, with specialized floating tables designed to navigate the ripples caused by the movements of the bathers. Heavy silver goblets filled with hippocras, a potent mix of red wine and honeyed spices, were passed from hand to hand as the heat of the water accelerated the intoxicating effects of the alcohol. This combination of thermal therapy and light intoxication created a state of relaxed euphoria, making the bathhouse the preferred location for celebrations marking everything from successful harvests to royal births. To eat while submerged was to claim a level of mastery over one's own physical needs and environment. The architecture of these bathing buildings was specifically designed to facilitate this culture of excess, featuring complex plumbing systems that were a true marvel of medieval engineering and design. Lead pipes and hollowed wooden conduits snaked through the thick stone walls to deliver fresh water from nearby springs to massive copper boilers that roared day and night in the basement. The floors were often tilted slightly to allow for constant and efficient drainage, ensuring that despite the communal nature of the activity, the water remained as fresh as possible for the distinguished guests. This infrastructure required a massive investment of capital, further cementing the bathhouse as a symbol of economic power. Hygiene in this period was never a private or humble act, it was a grand performance of wealth and health that required a small army of attendants to execute correctly for the enjoyment of the Lord. To be clean was to be powerful, as only those with significant resources could afford the wood for the fires, the labor for the water carrying, and the expensive imports required for the scents. A noble who appeared in public with the faint scent of lavender or rosemary clinging to his skin was signaling his dominance to all who crossed his path. It was a visible and olfactory proof that he possessed the luxury of time and the command over the basic elements of the natural world. This obsession with physical cleanliness created a strange and striking paradox in a world where the streets remained clogged with filth and the threat of disease was a constant shadow over every household. While the aristocracy soaked in their perfumed basins and enjoyed the finest wines, the peasants struggled to find enough clean water for basic survival and the prevention of illness. The bathhouse became a fortress of purity in a world of decay, a place where the elite could pretend that the physical corruption of the human condition did not apply to those of noble blood. It was an island of order and beauty surrounded by a sea of medieval squalor and uncontrolled suffering. By the year 1380, the cult of the bath had reached such proportions that even the most minor diplomatic encounters required a trip to the water to be considered valid and binding. To refuse an invitation to the baths was seen as a grave insult, a sign of deep-seated mistrust or perhaps a hidden physical ailment that the individual wished to keep secret from the world. The bath had become the primary stage for the performance of medieval identity, a place where the nakedness of the body revealed the truth of a person's status more clearly than any heraldic shield. The water acted as a great leveler of rank, yet it paradoxically reinforced the barriers of class. The fashion for these elaborate aquatic gatherings spread rapidly across borders, with the courts of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire competing to see who could build the most magnificent bathing halls. Innovations in one region, such as the use of heated stone floors or the introduction of exotic floral extracts from the East, were quickly copied and improved upon by rival monarchs. This international culture of the bath created a shared language of luxury that unified the disparate ruling families of Europe, providing a common ground for an elite that was often divided by war. The bathhouse was a rare point of cultural consensus in a century otherwise defined by conflict and religious schism. Emerging from the bathhouse back into the reality of the 14th century city was a jarring and often unpleasant experience that served to reinforce the allure of the steamy interior for the patron. The sudden transition from the scent of roses and warm wine to the smell of wood smoke, livestock, and waste reminded the individual that their time in the water was a precious and fragile escape. This contrast only served to increase the frequency of the visits, as the desire to return to the warmth and the soft light became a powerful psychological craving. The bathhouse was not just a place for the body, but a sanctuary for the mind that sought a temporary reprieve from a brutal world. The influence of the bathing culture extended deeply into the literature and art of the time, with illuminated manuscripts frequently depicting scenes of noblemen and ladies lounging in ornate wooden tubs. These images were often intended to be allegorical, representing the legendary fountain of youth or the cleansing of the soul from original sin, yet they were grounded in real experiences. The bath had become a central motif in the medieval imagination, representing the peak of earthly pleasure and the closest one could come to the promised comforts of the afterlife. In these paintings, the bathers are always depicted with serene expressions, their bodies idealized and free from the marks of the era. However, even at the very height of this obsession, there were those who looked upon the steaming chimneys of the stews with a growing sense of dread and moral disapproval. The preachers continued to rail against the bathhouses, not just for the immorality they supposedly fostered, but for the perceived physical weakness they instilled in the warriors of the realm. They argued that a man who spent his days in warm water and soft oils would be too soft and fragile to face the cold steel of a battlefield. This was a warning of cultural decline that would go largely unheeded until the world itself began to change in ways that no one could have predicted. In the final years of the 14th century, the bathhouse stood as a magnificent monument to a society that believed it had conquered the limitations of the human flesh through wealth. It was a time of golden light reflected in moving ripples, of skin warmed by constant steam, and of a culture that had found a way to make the most basic human need into a high art form. The sounds of laughter and the gentle splashing of water echoed through the halls of the great manors, a defiant symphony against the encroaching darkness of the next century. For a brief moment, the water was a source of life and joy, a vessel for a civilization that dared to bathe in the face of eternity. In the grand and turbulent history of the Holy Roman Empire, few figures emerge with as much enigmatic complexity as King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia. He was a man born into a world of crushing expectations and rigid dynastic duties, yet he found his only true refuge away from the cold marble floors of the throne room. To the astonishment of his contemporaries, the king retreated into a realm of vapor and heat, where the heavy velvet of his station was replaced by the constant embrace of warm water. For Wenceslas, the bath was not merely a place of cleansing but a sacred sanctuary where the chaos of his divided empire could not reach him, allowing him to exist in a state of fluid and humid tranquility. The king moved beyond simple enjoyment and began to weave his obsession into the very fabric of his courtly identity, creating what many considered a shadow government within the steam. He established a unique knightly fraternity that elevated the act of the bath to a high chivalric ritual, making the ordinary wooden tub a centerpiece of his royal heraldry and personal mythology. This order of the bath was unlike any other in Europe, as it did not celebrate the glory of the sword or the purity of the crusade but rather the intimate and transformative power of the water. To his bewildered peers, it seemed as though the monarch had abandoned the solid earth of his kingdom for an empire composed entirely of mist and ripples. His chosen emblem, the kingfisher bird surrounded by a flowing veil or a simple bath towel, began to appear on the walls of his castles and the margins of his most precious manuscripts. This bird, known for its mastery of both the air and the water, became the symbolic guardian of his private life, representing a ruler who felt more at home in the depths of a pool than on a horse. The towel, often depicted as a simple white cloth draped over the kingfisher, served as a provocative reminder that the most powerful man in the German lands was often completely naked and vulnerable. This subversion of traditional royal imagery signaled a shift in power from the public square to the most private and hidden of chambers. Within the secluded bathing halls of Prague Castle, Wenceslaus surrounded himself with a group of specialized attendants known as the bathmaids, who were far more than simple servants in his eyes. These women were the architects of his comfort, trained in the delicate arts of massage, the mixing of medicinal herbs, and the management of the king's volatile temperament. They moved through the thick clouds of steam with a quiet and ghostly grace, their presence serving as a human buffer between the monarch and the world of aggressive dukes and ambitious bishops. To the king, these women represented a purity and loyalty that he could not find among the bearded advisors who populated his formal council. The king's dependency on these aquatic sessions grew so profound that he began to spend entire days submerged in the warmth, ignoring the urgent messengers who brought news of rebellion and war. While the diet of the empire waited in vain for his presence, Wenceslaus was often found in the company of his bathmaids, discussing the intricacies of philosophy or the beauty of music while being scrubbed with lavender. He claimed that the weight of the crown of the Romans was a physical burden that only the buoyancy of the water could truly alleviate, allowing his mind to float free from the constraints of his duty. His ministers watched with growing horror as the gravity of the state was lost to the steam. This vulnerability was not a sign of weakness in the king's mind, but rather a source of ultimate psychological honesty that he believed was only possible when a man was stripped of his armor. He often remarked that a king without clothes was indistinguishable from a commoner, and in that shared humanity, he felt he could see the truth of those around him with greater clarity. However, this philosophy meant that the most dangerous secrets of the realm were often whispered into the ears of young women who held neither title nor land. These bathmaids became the silent keepers of the empire's destiny, knowing which lords were to be favored and which were to be crushed long before the decrees were signed. The political crises that defined his reign, such as the uprising of the Bohemian nobility in the year 1402, only served to drive him deeper into his watery fortress. Even when he was taken captive by his own brother Sigismund and held under guard, his primary demand was not for a sword or a lawyer, but for the regular presence of his favorite bathmaid and a heated tub. His captors were baffled by his insistence, viewing his need for a bath as a sign of mental instability or a peculiar form of cowardice. Yet for Wenceslaus, the ritual of the water was the only thing that maintained his sense of royal identity in the face of his public humiliation. It was during his imprisonment in the city of Vienna that the legend of his escape took on a nearly miraculous quality, centered entirely around the devotion of a bathmaid named Susanna. According to the stories that circulated through the taverns of Europe, it was Susanna who used the pretense of a late-night bath to facilitate the king's flight from his heavily guarded tower. She allegedly smuggled him through the city and across the river in a small boat, her knowledge of the hidden passages and the routines of the palace guards proving more effective than any army. This act of rescue cemented the bathmaid as a figure of heroic loyalty in the king's personal narrative. Upon his return to power, Wenceslaus rewarded Susanna with lands and wealth that rivaled the estates of the great barons, causing a scandal that resonated through the courts of the 14th century. He commissioned the creation of a magnificent illuminated Bible, known today as the Wenceslaus Bible, which was filled with hundreds of detailed drawings of bathmaids in their short shifts. These illustrations were not hidden away but were integrated into the sacred text, showing the girls carrying basins, sponges, and towels alongside the stories of the prophets. To the king, there was no contradiction between the divine word and the service of those who tended to his physical and spiritual needs. The clergy viewed these artistic choices with profound suspicion, seeing the ubiquitous presence of the bath girls in a holy manuscript as a sign of the king's moral corruption and impending madness. They argued that the king had allowed the sensory pleasures of the stews to infect his very soul, leading him to prioritize the touch of a servant over the salvation offered by the church. Wenceslaus, however, remained indifferent to their condemnations, continuing to hold his most important audiences while seated in his wooden tub. He felt that the steam acted as a natural filter for the lies and flattery of the priests, leaving only the raw and honest core of the conversation. The bathmaids themselves became a source of intense envy and fascination for the courtiers, who realized that the path to the king's favor led through the steam-filled hallways of the palace. These women were often the first to know of the monarch's changing moods, and they could subtly influence his decisions with a well-timed whisper or a gentle touch. They became informal diplomats, mediating between the king and those who were desperate for his attention, often receiving bribes and petitions that they would present during the evening bath. The rim of the royal tub became the most important desk in the kingdom, where the ink was often replaced by the droplets of perfumed water. The sensory environment that the king cultivated was a marvel of medieval engineering, featuring a complex system of copper pipes that brought hot and cold water directly into his private living quarters. He experimented with various herbal infusions, believing that certain combinations of woodruff, mint, and hyssop could grant him prophetic visions or the strength to overcome his enemies. The air in his chambers was perpetually humid, causing the expensive tapestries to sag and the ink on the parchment to smudge, as if the physical world was melting away. This atmosphere of constant moisture created a dreamlike quality to his reign, where the line between reality and hallucination was often blurred. As the king aged and the pressures of the Hussite wars began to tear his beloved Bohemia apart, his retreats into the water became more frequent and much more desperate in their intensity. He would remain in the bath for hours on end, his skin becoming wrinkled and pale, as he listened to the reports of burning churches and slaughtered peasants from behind the wooden screen. It was as if he hoped that the water could wash away the blood that was being spilled in his name, or that the steam could hide the sight of his crumbling authority. The bath had become his final redoubt, a small and fragile island of warmth in a world that was growing increasingly cold and violent. The rumors of his excessive drinking, often combined with his long hours in the hot tubs, led to a perception of the king as a man who had lost his grip on the physical requirements of his high office. His enemies painted a picture of a ruler who was perpetually intoxicated and surrounded by naked women, a king who had traded his crown for a sponge and his scepter for a cup of wine. While there was certainly an element of truth to these accusations, they failed to account for the deep-seated psychological need that drove Wenceslaus to seek comfort in the water. He was a man who felt the pain of the world too acutely and found his only anesthetic in the heat. Even in his final days at the new castle of Prague in the year 1419, the presence of the bathmaids remained his only source of genuine comfort and human connection. As the city below him erupted in the violence of the first defenestration, the king sought the familiar sounds of splashing water and the scent of roses to drown out the screams of the dying. He died as he had lived for much of his adult life, surrounded by the women who had seen him at his most vulnerable and who had served him with a devotion that transcended their humble origins. The king of the steam had finally succumbed to the cold reality he had spent a lifetime trying to wash away. The legacy of Wenceslaus IV remains inextricably linked to the image of the bath, a symbol of a ruler who chose the intimacy of the body over the cold abstraction of the state. His nightly order of the bathing tub may have vanished with him, but the questions he raised about the nature of power and vulnerability continue to haunt the historical record. He showed the world that even a monarch is a creature of flesh and blood, susceptible to the same needs for warmth and touch as the lowest of his subjects. In the steam of his baths, the rigid structures of the medieval world were momentarily dissolved, leaving behind only the memory of a king who wanted to be clean. The bathmaids who had once held the secrets of an empire faded back into the shadows of history, their names largely forgotten except for the legendary Susanna who lived on in the folk songs of the people. Their influence had been as ephemeral as the vapor that filled the royal chambers, yet for a few decades, they had been the true masters of the Bohemian court. They were the silent witnesses to the struggles of a man who was caught between the demands of a crown he never asked for and a peace he could only find in the water. The story of Wenceslaus is the story of a man who tried to govern from a tub, and in doing so, revealed the profound fragility of the throne. In the end, the king's obsession with the bath serves as a poignant reminder of the human desire for sanctuary in an era defined by its lack of mercy and its constant threat of physical suffering. Wenceslaus may have failed as a politician and a warrior, but he succeeded in creating a space where the sensory pleasures of life were celebrated with a rare and defiant intensity. His baths were a protest against the darkness of the Middle Ages, a humid and fragrant rebellion against the cold stone of history. Though his empire fell and his name was tarnished, the image of the kingfisher in the towel remains a testament to the men who sought his salvation in the warmth of the pool. In the echoing corridors of the royal palaces, a simple phrase began to carry a weight far beyond its literal meaning, drifting through the air like the very steam it referenced. To announce that one was going to wash became a signal that invited knowing glances and suppressed laughter among the seasoned members of the court. It was a verbal mask, a transparent veil that allowed the nobility to speak of their deepest indulgences without ever having to name them directly. This linguistic shift transformed the palace into a place of hidden layers, where every mundane statement about hygiene was treated as a secret invitation to a world of sensory excess. While the courtiers exchanged these subtle verbal cues, the religious authorities of the city watched with a growing sense of apocalyptic fury that could not be silenced. To the austere preachers who walked the stone aisles of the cathedrals, the word bath had become synonymous with the corruption of the soul and the abandonment of Christian modesty. They saw the clouds of vapor rising from the palace chimneys not as a sign of cleanliness, but as the literal breath of the devil rising from the depths of the earth. In their Sunday sermons, they shouted against the linguistic trickery of the elite, warning that no amount of perfumed water could wash away the stain of a life lived in a constant state of theatrical sin. The actual practice of these sessions evolved into a spectacular display of culinary and carnal abundance that defied the traditional boundaries of the dining hall. Massive wooden tubs were transformed into aquatic banquet tables, where the surface of the water was covered with specialized floating trays made of light cedar and cork. On these trays sat the roasted carcasses of pheasants, their feathers replaced by golden leaf, and silver bowls filled with the heartiest stews and sugared delicacies. It was a feast where the participants remained submerged, their bodies warmed by the liquid while their palates were stimulated by the finest products of the royal kitchens, creating a total immersion in pleasure. Interspersed among the floating dishes were heavy crystal goblets and silver decanters overflowing with the most potent wines of the southern provinces, chilled with ice from the mountains. The movement of the water, caused by the playful shifting of the bathers, created a rhythmic clinking of glass and metal that provided a constant musical backdrop to the evening. Beside the monarch sat his favorites, their skin glistening with the moisture of the room and the oils used to enrich the bath, their task far more complex than simple attendance. They were the living ornaments of this watery theater, serving as both companions and conduits for the king's most intimate desires as they shared the vintage from his own cup. The central act of these group sessions was the ritualized lathering of the sovereign, a task performed with an almost religious intensity by the gathered concubines. Their movements were slow and deliberate, designed to prolong the physical contact and maximize the sensory impact of the aromatic agents being applied to the skin. Using sponges gathered from the deep seas and soft linen cloths, they worked the expensive suds into the king's muscles, turning the act of cleaning into a prolonged experience of tactile delight. In this humid twilight, the traditional hierarchy of the state was momentarily dissolved, replaced by a more primal and immediate connection between the ruler and those who tended to his body. The soap used in these royal chambers was a product of immense luxury, crafted by master artisans who guarded their secret formulas with the same ferocity as a royal alchemist. It was manufactured from a base of the purest olive oils imported from distant Mediterranean shores, mixed with the fine ash of specific hardwoods and enriched with the essence of jasmine and ambergris. A single bar of this substance cost more than the annual wages of a master stonemason, making its use a profound statement of economic dominance. To own such soap was to possess a piece of the world's most concentrated wealth, a substance that existed only to be washed away in a few moments of frantic and expensive indulgence. In the clandestine correspondence of the nobility, the term soap began to appear as a vital code word for the organization of private gatherings that bypassed the eyes of the censors. To receive a letter mentioning the delivery of a new shipment of scented soap was an invitation to an evening where the participants would cast off their social roles along with their clothes. This coded language allowed the aristocracy to maintain a facade of respectability while secretly coordinating the most elaborate and scandalous events of the decade. The word became a skeleton key that opened the doors to a hidden society, a linguistic bond that united those who shared in the forbidden rituals of the palace bathhouses. The staggering cost of maintaining these aquatic playgrounds began to manifest in the official royal treasuries, where the accounts for bathmaids and aromatic oils started to cast a long shadow. When the financial advisors analyzed the ledgers of the 1400s, they discovered a disturbing trend where the expenditures for the baths surpassed the funding for the kingdom's heavy cavalry. A single afternoon of communal bathing, with its requirements for fuel, imported spices, and the salaries of dozens of specialized women, could cost more than the armor and mounts for a full squadron of knights. It was a literal drain on the resources of the state, where the defense of the borders was sacrificed for the comfort of the tub. The treasurer of the realm, a man used to the harsh mathematics of war and famine, looked upon the bills for rosewater and fine linens with a mixture of despair and quiet terror. He saw clearly that the kingdom's readiness for conflict was being eroded by the very liquid that was supposed to preserve the king's health. Each gallon of scented oil represented dozens of pikes that would never be forged and walls that would never be repaired against the encroaching enemies of the state. Yet, the king's command for a fresh bath was absolute, and the gold continued to flow from the iron chests into the pockets of the soap makers and the keepers of the royal woods. As the century progressed, the architectural distinction between the bathing chamber and the royal bedchamber began to vanish entirely, creating a unified space dedicated to the flesh. The great wooden tubs were no longer isolated in the damp basements or separate pavilions but were moved into the very heart of the king's private apartments. Beds were constructed with waterproof curtains and soft drainage systems, allowing the monarch to transition from the water to the sheets without ever leaving the humid warmth of the steam. This integration symbolized the total triumph of the bath over all other aspects of private life, turning the palace into a sprawling temple of permanent and moist luxury. The sensory impact of these sessions was one of overwhelming richness, where the flicker of hundreds of beeswax candles reflected off the constant ripples of the water to create a world of dancing light. The heavy tapestries on the walls, damp with the rising vapor, depicted scenes of ancient gods and goddesses in their own mythological baths, further blurring the line between history and current reality. The participants moved through this landscape of gold leaf and wet stone as if they were part of a living painting, their bodies the primary medium of an art form that celebrated the immediate and the temporary. It was a theater of the flesh where the audience and the performers were one and the same. The air in these chambers was so saturated with moisture that it began to affect the very fabric of the palace, causing the wooden beams to swell and the plaster to peel away in long, pale strips. This decay was ignored by the bathers, who saw the physical ruin of the building as a small price to pay for the preservation of their own comfort. The sound of water dripping from the ceiling became a rhythmic accompaniment to the whispers of the courtiers, a constant reminder of the fluid and unstable nature of the environment they had created. In this world of rotten roses, the only thing that mattered was the warmth of the tub and the touch of the person sitting next to you. Contemporary chroniclers recorded these developments with a mixture of horrified fascination and righteous indignation, noting how the dignity of the throne was being washed away. They described scenes where the king would grant audiences to foreign ambassadors while still submerged, forcing the bewildered diplomats to negotiate treaties while trying to ignore the naked women swimming around their feet. These accounts portrayed a world that had lost its moral compass, where the gravity of international law was replaced by the shifting values of the bathing house. The bath was no longer a place of rest, but a primary seat of government where the most important decisions were made in the steam. Foreign dignitaries who visited the court often returned to their own lands with tales of a kingdom that had replaced its iron resolve with an obsession for soap and sponges. They spoke of the shock of seeing a monarch completely stripped of his royal regalia, vulnerable and wet, yet still issuing commands that determined the fate of thousands of souls. This perception of weakness invited aggression from neighboring states, who saw the steam-filled palaces not as centers of power, but as symbols of a society that had grown too soft to defend itself. The laughter of the bathhouse was heard as a signal of vulnerability by those who still lived by the sword and the shield. The women who inhabited this steam-filled world, officially labeled as simple bath attendants, leveraged their proximity to the royal person to amass a level of political influence that was unprecedented. By controlling the king's access to the most relaxing and pleasurable moments of his day, they could influence his perception of his enemies and allies with ease. A whispered suggestion while scrubbing the monarch's back could lead to the downfall of a powerful duke or the promotion of an obscure cleric who had paid for their favor. These bathmaids became the unofficial gatekeepers of the kingdom, their power rooted in the most vulnerable and private aspects of the ruler's daily routine. Philosophers of the era began to debate the implications of this lifestyle, suggesting that the constant immersion in warm water was leading to a physical and moral softening of the ruling class. They argued that the ancient virtues of the warrior had been dissolved in the perfumed basins of the palace, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to more disciplined and austere enemies. This narrative of decay was fueled by the visible contrast between the opulence of the royal baths and the increasing poverty and unrest in the surrounding countryside. The tub became a symbol of a detached and decadent elite who had forgotten the harsh realities of the world outside their steam-filled sanctuaries. In this theater of flesh, the water itself was merely a decorative element, a necessary prop that allowed the drama of human desire and power to unfold in a socially acceptable guise. The actual act of cleaning was almost entirely forgotten, replaced by a complex series of social performances that defined the life of the court. Each splash and each application of soap was a beat in a choreographed spectacle that reinforced the king's position as the ultimate source of all pleasure in the realm. The bath was the one place where the monarch's control was absolute, not through the threat of the sword, but through the distribution of sensory and immediate delight. The coded letters that survived from this period reveal a network of aristocratic intrigue that relied entirely on the shared experience of the baths for its survival and secrecy. References to the temperature of the water or the fragrance of the soap were used to convey information about the king's health, his current favorites, and the shifting alliances of the inner circle. These documents provide a window into a world where the bathhouse was the primary hub of information, a place where the most sensitive data was exchanged in the safety of a room filled with steam. The privacy of the bath provided a level of security that even the most secure fortress or castle could not match. As the night wore on and the fires in the boilers began to die down, the atmosphere in the bathing hall would shift from one of high energy to a state of exhausted and humid lethargy. The participants would emerge from the tubs, their skin sensitized by the heat and the oils, to be wrapped in layers of warm silk and carried away to their private quarters. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of spent perfumes and the cooling water, which sat stagnant in the massive wooden basins until the morning. This daily cycle of excess left a permanent mark on the palace, a lingering smell of musk and moisture that haunted the halls long after the last bather had finally departed. Outside the palace gates, the reality of the Middle Ages continued its brutal course, with famine and minor plagues claiming the lives of the peasantry with rhythmic and terrifying frequency. The contrast between the sterile, perfumed world of the royal bath and the mud-caked misery of the city streets was a chasm that no amount of charity or decree could ever hope to bridge. The elite lived in a perpetual summer of their own making, while the rest of the world shivered in the cold and the dark. This disconnection from the reality of their subjects was the true price of the royal baths, a cost that would eventually be paid when the fragile peace of the kingdom finally shattered. The final irony of this period was that the very water intended to purify and protect the monarch became the medium of his isolation from the people he was meant to lead. The deeper he sank into the warmth of the tub, the further he drifted from the responsibilities of the crown and the survival of his dynasty. The theater of flesh was a distraction that could not last forever, as the shadows of history began to lengthen and the heat of the world outside started to exceed even the fires of the palace boilers. The golden age of the bath was a dream of steam that was destined to evaporate, leaving behind only the cold and bitter reality of a world that had forgotten how to wash. The serene atmosphere of the late 15th century began to dissolve as the year 1494 brought a terrifying shift to the European continent. The warm, rose-scented mist that had defined the elite existence for generations was suddenly pierced by a cold and sharp wind blowing from the battlefields of the south. It was a time of chaotic transition, where the echoes of splashing water were replaced by the rhythmic tramping of weary soldiers returning from the Italian campaigns. These men brought with them more than just stories of conquest, they carried a silent and invisible passenger that would soon bring the golden age of the bathhouse to a violent and permanent end. The great pox spread with a predatory speed through the crowded centers of trade and power, leaving a trail of disfigured faces and broken bodies in its wake. This was not the quick death of the older plagues, but a lingering invisible corruption that seemed to mock the very idea of physical beauty and luxury. As the first pustules appeared on the skin of nobles and commoners alike, the communal bathhouse was immediately identified as the primary breeding ground for this new horror. The once inviting steam now looked like a toxic cloud, and the shared warmth of the wooden tubs was viewed as a trap where the healthy and the infected were inextricably mingled in a fatal embrace. From the high pulpits of the great cathedrals, the clergy seized upon this medical catastrophe to launch a final and devastating assault on the culture of the bath. Priests who had long grumbled about the immorality of the stews now found their ultimate weapon in the form of divine retribution. They shouted to their terrified congregations that the pox was the literal fire of God's wrath, a physical manifestation of the sins committed in the vapor. The bathhouse was no longer a place of healing but a gateway to hell, where the pursuit of earthly pleasure led directly to the rotting of the flesh and the eternal damnation of the soul in the afterlife. The theological argument against bathing was reinforced by a new and terrifying medical theory that gripped the imagination of the ruling classes. Physicians of the era began to claim that the primary danger of the bath lay in the heat of the water, which forced the pores of the skin to open wide. In this vulnerable state, they argued, the body was defenseless against the invisible miasmas of disease and the demonic influences that floated in the air. To bathe was to intentionally tear down the natural walls of the body, allowing the pestilence to flow directly into the blood and the vital organs. The very act of washing was now reframed as an act of slow and deliberate suicide. As the panic intensified, the great public stews that had flourished for centuries were systematically boarded up and abandoned to the rats. In cities like Paris, London, and Prague, the sound of hammers ringing against wood signaled the death of a social institution that had once been the pride of the urban middle class. The massive copper boilers were dragged out into the streets to be melted down for cannon, and the ornate wooden tubs were left to rot in the damp darkness of the cellars. The vibrant social life that had centered around the water vanished almost overnight, leaving behind only empty buildings and a lingering sense of profound and widespread communal dread. The transformation within the royal palaces was even more dramatic and psychological, as the monarchs who had once lived in the water began to fear it like a deadly poison. The elaborate plumbing systems that had been the marvel of the age were allowed to fall into disrepair, their lead pipes clogging with lime and their fountains falling silent. A king who had previously spent hours in the company of bathmaids now viewed a simple basin of warm water with a suspicion that bordered on the pathological. The royal apartments, once humid and fragrant, became dry and dusty vaults where the windows were kept tightly sealed to prevent even a single drop of moisture from entering. This sudden rejection of water created a vacuum that was quickly filled by the rise of a new and heavily artificial aesthetic of hygiene. Since the body could no longer be washed, the elite turned to the use of heavy powders and potent perfumes to mask the accumulating sense of their own physical existence. The demand for musk, civet, and ambergris reached unprecedented heights as the aristocracy attempted to create a portable atmosphere of fragrance around their unwashed persons. To smell of the laboratory rather than the skin became the new mark of status, a chemical shield intended to prove that the wearer was protected from the corruptions of the world outside their heavy silk clothing. The skin itself began to be treated as a decorative surface rather than a living organ, covered in thick layers of white lead powder and rouge to hide the marks of time and disease. This heavy makeup served a dual purpose, acting both as a fashion statement and as a physical barrier that purportedly sealed the dangerous pores against the encroaching plague. A nobleman would spend hours at his dressing table, being dusted with finely ground starch until he resembled a marble statue, frozen in a state of permanent and powdery artificiality. The vibrant and wet reality of the previous century was replaced by a dry and brittle mask that allowed for no physical spontaneity or natural movement. A strange new definition of piety began to emerge from this era of filth, where the neglect of the body was seen as a sign of spiritual dedication. To be covered in the dust of the world and to carry the scent of long-term abstinence from water was interpreted by some as a rejection of the carnal vanities that had led to the great pox. Some extremist thinkers even argued that the more one suffered from the itching and the odors of a dirty body, the closer one was to the state of the holy hermits of old. Cleanliness, once considered a virtue next to godliness, was now viewed as a suspicious remnant of a pagan and decadent past that had nearly destroyed Christendom. The legendary bathmaids, who had once held the secrets of empires and the hearts of kings, found themselves cast out into a world that now viewed their profession as synonymous with death and contagion. Those who did not flee were often hounded by the authorities or forced into the lowest forms of labor, their specialized skills in massage and herbalism now regarded as the dark arts of the temptress. The memory of their presence in the royal chambers was scrubbed from the official histories, replaced by a narrative of somber and dry duty. They became the scapegoats for a societal collapse they had no part in creating, their legacy buried under the weight of a new and joyless morality. By the end of the 1500s, the shift was complete, and the royal courts of Europe had entered a phase of sensory stagnation that would last for centuries. The great halls that had once smelled of rosewater and spice now reeked of stale sweat, heavy incense, and the sharp tang of vinegar used to clean the floors. The monarchs moved through their palaces like ghosts, encased in layers of linen and velvet that were rarely removed, their lives defined by a constant and exhausting effort to remain dry. The vibrant and fluid world of Wenceslas and his contemporaries had been replaced by a static and fearful society that saw a puddle of water as a portal to the grave. The physical impact of this change was visible in the increasing frailty and skin ailments of the nobility, who suffered from a lack of basic hygiene that their ancestors would have found incomprehensible. Without the regular stimulation of the bath, the health of the ruling class began to decline, making them even more susceptible to the very diseases they were trying to avoid. Yet, the psychological grip of the fear of water was so absolute that no physician dared to suggest a return to the old ways. The collective memory of the great pox had created a trauma that was passed down through the generations, turning the act of immersion into a cultural taboo that few had the courage to challenge. In the final decades of this transition, the once celebrated art of the bath was reduced to a few whispered legends and some decaying manuscripts hidden in the back of royal libraries. The beautiful illustrations of the Wenceslas Bible were viewed with a mixture of horror and prurient fascination by those who could not understand how a king could have been so reckless. To the people of the new century, the idea of a royal bath with on-call companions seemed like a dream from a distant and alien planet, a dangerous fantasy that had been rightly extinguished by the hand of God. The world had become a much darker and more pungent place, where the sun never set on the empire of the unwashed. The heavy perfumes and the thick powders could not, however, completely hide the growing sense of unease that permeated the courts of the great powers. Beneath the lace and the jewelry, there was a profound and lingering fear that the barrier between the body and the world was failing, and that the plague was always just one open pore away. This constant state of anxiety replaced the relaxed euphoria of the 14th century tubs, creating a culture of suspicion and isolation that defined the early modern era. The laughter of the bathhouse had been replaced by the hushed whispers of the confessional and the scratching of pens recording the latest death tolls from the city gates. Thus, the golden age of steam evaporated into the dry air of the Renaissance, leaving behind a legacy of hidden rot and artificial fragrance. The transition from the wet to the dry was more than just a change in hygiene, it was a fundamental shift in the human relationship with the physical self and the natural world. The body was no longer a vessel for pleasure to be celebrated and cleansed, but a source of danger to be contained and concealed at all costs. As the century drew to a close, the final remnants of the medieval bath vanished, leaving a world that was spiritually upright, morally certain, and physically or profoundly filthy in every conceivable way. The conclusion of this grand historical trajectory is saturated with a profound sense of irony and a creeping, systemic horror that would define European life for the next 300 years. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th and 18th, the once revered culture of the aromatic bath did not merely fade, it was actively demonized and replaced by a civilization of dry, powdered surface. The transition from the humid, communal warmth of the medieval tub to the frigid and static atmosphere of the early modern court represented a spectacular regression in the history of human hygiene. What was once seen as a path to health and spiritual clarity became a gateway to certain death and moral ruin in the eyes of an entire continent. The brilliant monarchs who sat upon the most powerful thrones in Christendom, figures whose ancestors had once luxuriated in perfumed waters with their chosen companions, now took a perverse pride in their total avoidance of moisture. By the middle of the 17th century, the highest mark of a gentleman's status was no longer the scent of lavender and the glow of clean skin, but the visible accumulation of dry powder and the heavy layers of silk that concealed a terrifying reality. The fear of water had become so deeply embedded in the collective psyche that even the most basic act of splashing the face was viewed with a suspicion that bordered on the religious, as if the very touch of a liquid could dissolve the soul. Beneath the magnificent embroidered waistcoats and the sweeping velvet robes of the aristocracy, the human body was transformed into a breeding ground for countless varieties of parasites and skin diseases. In the absence of water, the natural oils of the skin mingled with the dust of the palace and the heavy lead-based powders to create a thick, suffocating crust that was never removed. Underneath this artificial shell, the skin began to itch, crack, and eventually ulcerate, creating a hidden landscape of physical suffering that the elite endured with a stoic and misplaced sense of nobility. The vibrant, breathing bodies of the 14th century bathers were replaced by these walking monuments to human neglect. The presence of lice became an inescapable and almost respected feature of courtly life, with tiny golden combs and ivory scrapers becoming essential fashion accessories for the well-born. These parasites lived in the towering, powdered wigs that were never washed, migrating from the hair of the servant to the scalp of the queen with a democratic indifference that the laws of the land could never match. At the great banquets of Versailles or the winter balls of Vienna, the subtle scratching of a noble hand against a silken sleeve was a rhythmic accompaniment to the music of the violins. It was a world where the highest peak of human civilization was literally infested with the most primitive of creatures. The concept of the dry wash replaced the ritual of the tub, where the skin was rubbed with pieces of linen until the most visible grime was moved from one part of the body to another. This practice was based on the misguided medical belief that rubbing stimulated the blood while keeping the pores safely sealed against the invisible miasmas that allegedly carried the plague. A king might go through 6 changes of linen in a single afternoon, believing that this was the pinnacle of cleanliness, while the accumulated sweat and bacteria of decades remained trapped against his flesh. This performative hygiene was a tragic farce, a theater of cleanliness that existed only on the very surface of the silk. The physical stench of the great palaces became a legend in itself, a suffocating mixture of stale perspiration, unwashed hair, and the sharp, cloying scents of musk and civet used to overwhelm the smell of decay. Without the drainage systems of the old bathhouses, the corridors of the royal residences often served as open sewers, with the stench rising through the floorboards to mingle with the expensive incense. Visitors to the court would often faint not from the heat or the emotion, but from the sheer olfactory assault of hundreds of unwashed bodies crowded into a single room. The air was a thick and heavy soup of human waste and artificial flower extracts, a sensory nightmare disguised as a paradise. The psychological phobia of water grew to such proportions that the mere sight of a deep basin or a flowing river could trigger a state of genuine panic or a physical swoon among the nobility. Stories were told of dukes and countesses who had not touched water in 40 years, boasting of their dry health as if it were a shield granted by the heavens themselves. To them, the medieval ancestors who had splashed in the stews were seen as primitive savages who had invited the great pox upon themselves through their reckless exposure to the elements. The entire concept of the bath was relegated to the realm of myth, a dangerous and ancient practice that had been wisely abolished for the survival of the race. The grand architecture of the palaces was redesigned to reflect this new reality, with the magnificent bathing halls of the past being walled up or converted into dusty storage rooms for broken furniture. The complex lead pipes that had once brought hot water to the king's private chambers were left to corrode and leak, eventually becoming silent witnesses to a lost technology. In their place came the dressing room, a dry and airless space where the monarch was encased in layers of starch and bone, a process that took hours and required the labor of dozens of servants who were just as filthy as their master. The fluid world of the steam had been entirely conquered by the static world of the wardrobe. The irony of the 18th century, the so-called Age of Reason, was that it was perhaps the most physically repulsive era in the entire history of the Western world. While philosophers debated the nature of liberty and the laws of the universe, they did so while sitting in chairs that were stained with the oils of their own unwashed hair and skin. The intellectual brilliance of the period was matched only by the intensity of its bodily neglect, creating a strange disconnect between the purity of the mind and the corruption of the vessel that held it. The legacy of the medieval bath, with its focus on the holistic health of the body and the spirit, was seen as a relic of a superstitious age. The final terror of this 300-year regression was the slow realization that the very things intended to protect the elite were the primary sources of their decline and early death. The heavy lead powders used to mask the skin were toxic, slowly poisoning the blood of the ladies and gentlemen who applied them with such diligence every morning. The avoidance of water led to systemic infections and a lack of basic wound care that turned minor scratches into fatal gangrene. The society that had turned its back on the water found itself drowning in its own artificiality, dying from 1,000 small and preventable ailments that their 14th-century forebears would have easily avoided. The legendary bathmaid, who had once been the silent architect of royal peace, was replaced by the wig-maker and the apothecary, figures who traded in chemicals and hair instead of water and herbs. These new practitioners of the royal person were not focused on the comfort of the body, but on the maintenance of the facade, ensuring that the king looked like a god even as he smelled like a corpse. They were the masters of the dry ritual, the high priests of the powder box who ensured that no drop of moisture would ever threaten the brittle dignity of the throne. Their art was the art of concealment, a skill that grew more complex as the physical reality beneath the clothes became more horrific. In the final decades of this era, the legends of the medieval stews began to take on a quality of forbidden and impossible romance in the whispered conversations of the young. They heard stories of a time when the king and his ladies were truly clean, when their skin was as soft as the silk they wore and their breath smelled of mint and roses without the need for chemicals. To these young aristocrats, living in a world of itching lice and heavy perfumes, the idea of a communal bath seemed like a lost Eden, a place of freedom and sensory joy that had been taken away by the cold hand of a fearful church and a mistaken science. The history of the European bath is the story of a civilization that voluntarily chose the dark and the dry over the light and the wet, trading a genuine and ancient wisdom for a modern and deadly ignorance. The medieval era, so often dismissed as a time of ignorance and filth, was in fact the zenith of human hygiene, a period where the body was treated with a reverence and care that would not be seen again until the very end of the 19th century. The kings who washed with their concubines were the last true masters of the human form, living in a state of physical honesty that their descendants could only dream of achieving from behind their masks of lead. The final emotional reaction to this story is one of profound indignation and a lingering fear of how easily a society can be convinced to abandon its own well-being in the name of a false security. We look back at the 3 centuries of the Great Filth not as a period of progress, but as a long and dark tunnel of physical misery that was entirely self-imposed. The sight of a silken now carries the phantom scent of unwashed flesh, and the glitter of the palace chandeliers is dimmed by the knowledge of the parasites that lived beneath the gold leaf. The tragedy of the bath is the tragedy of a world that forgot how to be human in its attempt to become holy. As we conclude this journey through the steam and the shadows, we are left with the image of the great wooden tub, now empty and rotting in a forgotten cellar, as the ultimate symbol of what was lost to the fear of the water. It represents a time when the touch of a human hand and the warmth of a scented pool were enough to wash away the sins of the world and the burdens of the crown. The medieval bath was a testament to the belief that the body was a temple worthy of care, a belief that was shattered by the march of the pox and the fury of the preacher. The world became a cleaner place only after it had spent centuries learning the hard lesson that the absence of water is the presence of death. The most clean living class in the history of the world had transformed itself into the most foul-smelling and physically corrupted, leaving behind a legacy of legends about a time when a king and his ladies were truly pure in their nakedness. The irony is complete, the horror is total, and the lesson is written in the scars and the lice of 300 years of self-imposed squalor. The history of the bath is not a story of hygiene, but a story of the human soul's struggle to remain connected to its own physical reality in a world that constantly seeks to cover it in powder and lies. We are the inheritors of both the steam and the filth, forever caught between the memory of the rose and the reality of the dust.